Back in the day, there was a movie called Vantage Point. It was not a good movie. It was an adequate movie. It had Dennis Quaid in it. And the premise of the movie was there was an assassination attempt on the president. And now the movie broke it down, and it was from everyone's different perspective. And it was amazing to see how people saw things differently based on where they were. And I thought about it, and that really applies to even us and who we are. We see people, and we assume what we see we know to be true. I see you, I see the outside of you, and so that must be truly who you are. So I thought we'd do a little quiz today. How many of you think you know me? Show me, raise your hands. None of you? Awesome. This will be a short quiz. I have some questions my family is not allowed to answer because that would be cheating. So, was I raised a country girl, city girl, redneck, or hick? Yell it out. Redneck. I know how to go stump jumping and throw a Brody in the parking lot with the best of them. I know that rusted out Ford is not a piece of junk, it is the planter in your front yard. So here's a good one. What state was I born in? You're right, I was not born in a state. That was a trick question. I was born in Washington, D.C. And despite what people think, it is not Maryland. I know exactly who did not pass U.S. history because they'll say, isn't that in Maryland? Yeah, you didn't pass that junior year thing, did you? So what is the one food I really want to like, but I just cannot do it? And by the way, Pastor Janine and I are on the same page on this one. We both talk about how much we want to like this food, but we can't. No, yogurt. Peas are gross. Let's just be honest, peas are like, yeah, Pastor Janine and I stand there and we both say, man, I really want to like yogurt, but then when it comes to actually, do I have plans to own another dog? No. Absolutely not, ever, ever, no, not ever doing that again. No, I don't know. I have a husband who would be also no. I have harder questions. How many stepdads did I have?
6. Too many.
3. Who was the first person to tell me that women should not be pastors?
Your husband.
My husband, no, he said, what did I sign on for, though, once in a while? It was a step sibling who called me and said women should not lead men past the age of 6, which would preclude me from a lot of what I do. So that was the first person to tell me women don't belong here. What am I most afraid of? You would think spiders, but no, spiders are not the thing. The thing that I am most afraid, there's 2 answers here. My kids? Yeah. Okay, well, my kids are one of my biggest fears is that my children will walk away from their faith. I live in fear of that. And I live in fear that I would do or say something that would turn someone else away from their faith. That hell thing freaks me out. If you know me well enough, you'll know that hell, I don't really like. I really want the Catholics to be right and there be a purgatory because I really don't like the hell thing. And I know they're not, but I look really hard in the Bible and try to find it because I just really want it. I'm still looking. What was the greatest grief in my life? So I had 3 stepdads, right? So I was pretty much raised by my auntie, my uncle, and my grandmother. And 27 years ago, before we were married, my grandmother passed away in November, my auntie passed away in January, and my uncle passed away in March. He still married me. I was a mess from the word go. So, but he still married me in those whole random... Oh, it's the chicken noodle soup they used to make me. Keep going, honey. So anyway, so now you know a little bit more about me. That explains some of who I am. It gives us, as we know each other's stories, we know each other better. We've got to not make the assumptions based on what we see. And there's a movie clip from the movie Passengers, which I do like. There's one naughty scene in it because I always feel obligated to, so be aware. There is one scene that I go, oh, fast forward. But this was a good movie, and it shows how we perceive people.
So all you see here is 5,000 suckers?
I see zeros on the Homestead Company's bottom line.
I see 5,000 men and women changing their lives. For 5,000 different reasons. You don't know these people.
I'm a journalist. I know people.
Really? This one. Is he a banker, a teacher, or a gardener?
Banker.
He's a gardener. All right. Chef, accountant, or midwife?
She has to be a midwife. There's no way you just made that one up.
Yeah, she's a midwife. I didn't know they still had midwives.
I like her. We'd be friends.
You think you can see that?
Don't you?
I do.
Our presumptions and perceptions of others, it's a very humanistic thing, and it really comes naturally to us. The problem is, it's not very Jesus-like. Jesus looks beyond the trappings of the outer person and looks straight into the heart. He sees more in us than we see in ourselves. Take Matthew for an example. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with such scum?" Matthew, a tax collector, was a very unlikely candidate for the post of disciple. He was a tax collector. No one forced him into this position. Collectors back then were volunteers. Now, volunteering isn't a bad thing, except for when you volunteer for the people who conquered your people and you're lining your own pockets off the labors of your own countrymen. Tax collectors were not only despised people, they were turned away from their own faith practices. They were barred from going into the synagogues, and they were placed in the same category as unclean animals. Who'd like that moniker? Hey, I'm an unclean animal. The first word, unclean, has nothing to do with dirt. Dirt can be easily washed off. The unclean we're talking about is a biblical unclean, and it's like tar on a hot day. It sticks. They risked their lives if they tried to sneak into the temple, and they tried to get on the side, they risked their lives. There's a lack of spiritual unholiness that the priests and pastors did not want them in there. So basically, they were telling the tax collectors they weren't good enough for God. Their uncleanliness kept them apart from the Father. To be classified as an unclean animal gives the depiction of someone who is a much lower station in life. In the New Testament culture, animals were working animals or they were dinner. The value in an animal was in what they could do or what they could provide. They were not cute, cuddly. There was no pampering and taking them to the groomer. There was no cute little outfits that we dressed them in on the holidays. They were a meal. So Matthew, he's just sitting there. He's being scorned by the passerbys. He's trying to ignore their glares and stares, some unkind comments, kind of under the breath. Oh, yeah. Then Jesus walks by and says, "Hey, Matthew, why don't you leave your tax collector booth behind and follow me?" Now, Jesus isn't dumb. He knows exactly what these other people are thinking of Matthew, but he extends the invitation anyway. I wonder how long it took the rumors to travel through town. Did you see who Jesus was talking to? Oh, it's way worse than talking to him. He's actually going to go have dinner at his house. No way, like dinner at the same table, eating dishes from the same bowl? Ugh, there's not enough antibacterial soap to get all those germs off. I know, right? Does he realize he's eating with scum? Jesus didn't see the uncleanliness. Jesus saw the heart. He looked deep into the depths of Matthew's soul and saw a leader. Jesus saw someone who could help spearhead the charge in getting the good news out to all the men and women and children. Jesus didn't see who Matthew was. Jesus saw who Matthew could be. By choosing Matthew, Jesus clearly sent the message that no one was beyond the reach of his love. No one was so unclean that Jesus could not find potential in them and love them. By the choosing of Matthew, he also lays a challenge before us. How do we see beyond the surface of the person and really see the hearts? Everyone, every single one of us, everyone sitting in this room has a story. and everyone has experiences which help inform and interact with the world. Our pasts inform who we are, but they don't define who we are. Our past, I am shaped by the fact that I had 3 stepfathers. I am so committed that when Ed and I got married, we agreed death before divorce. Now, it hasn't come to that yet, but it informs us. So we cannot let our past define us. We need to be careful to make sure that our past only informs and we learn from what happened before. So, because I really don't think a person wakes up one morning and says, hey, I think I'd like to spend the rest of my life really bitter and angry. I think that's a great way to live, just hating everything around me. I think there is a daily piling on of the anger, of not forgiving, of holding on tightly to the past. What we think is how we act, and how we act lets people know who we are, and by knowing who we are, they will respond accordingly. So take a moment, turn to each other, and problem-solve ways we can get beyond our outer trappings of the person, the walls meant to protect and not show the true self. How do we see others as Jesus sees them? No, really, turn to each other. There's plenty of you here today. Turn and ask, how do we do these things? I even put the question up for those of you who weren't listening. All right, we're going to move on to the woman at the well. You know that woman at the well, the naughty one? The ones whose wives kept a close eye on their husbands when she walked by? John 4:27 reads, "Just then his disciples came back. They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, 'What do you want with her? Why are you talking to her?'" In the biblical text, they end the questions with question marks. I feel like they might have been questions, but there's probably a lot more exclamation points. What in the world is he doing talking to her? Because strike one, she's a woman. Women, good women, operated within the boundaries of their culture and did not talk to other men unless their husbands were around. Strike two, she was not only a woman, she was a Samaritan. The Jewish people despised and avoided contact with the Samaritans. This wasn't a short-term conflict like the Hatfield and McCoys. This clash had gone on for centuries. Some scholars even dated it all the way back to just before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. Strike three, she was a naughty Samaritan woman. She had 5 husbands and was living with the 6th. 3 strikes, you're out, right? You can argue all day with the umpire, but he's just going to stand there and stare you down. You swung, you missed, you're done. Thank goodness Jesus isn't the umpire. Not only does he invite the Samaritan woman back into the batter's box, he offers her a drink of water. And not just any water, but living water, water that quenches the thirst of the soul. Another pitch, another swing, and this time, home run. After the encounter with Jesus, verse 28 reads, "The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, 'Come see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?' So the people came streaming from the village to see him." You see, the disciples saw a despised Samaritan woman. Jesus saw an evangelist. If he had been operating on the 3 strikes you're out mode and not engaged this woman in conversation, her entire city may have missed the opportunity to hear the good news. The disciples let centuries of distrust and dislike cloud their vision. But Jesus had a clear vision of who she was and who she should become. So I'm going to let you talk this time, really talk to one another and ask, take a moment and in your head, actually, I just got ahead of myself. How does Jesus see you? What words? How do you think Jesus sees you? He loves you. Redeemed. Right? Those are good words. Sometimes I think Jesus looks at me and thinks, "Oi." So, and a lot of times how we see ourselves and how Jesus sees us aren't in alignment. I know God loves me, but there are times I question why God would love me. I question my faith. I question who I am. I question, well, what was he thinking inviting me to be a pastor? So now turn to one another and ask, why is it hard for us sometimes to line up what we think with what we know of how Jesus feels about us. All right, John 1:43-46 reads, Philip went to look for Nathanael and told him, "We have found the very person Moses and the prophets wrote about. His name is Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth." "Nazareth," exclaimed Nathanael. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" "Come and see for yourself," Philip replied. So I'm going to name some places, and I want you to throw out the first descriptive word that comes to mind. The south side of Chicago. Crime. Keep yelling, I can only hear you one at a time. Crime? Ghetto, gangs. Okay, what if I said Anaheim? Disneyland, happiest place on earth. Inner city LA. Crabbing? Traffic. I thought she said crabbing, and I'm like, how do you crab in inner city LA? So, Dallas. Cowboys. I was thinking big hair. This is a loaded one. Seattle. Thank you for coffee. The first thing my husband blurted out was liberal. So, can anything good come from Nazareth? Why do we judge people based on geography? Realtors say location, location, location. But does location really define a person? I grew up in the woods. Does that automatically make me a gun-toting, tree-falling, fish-catching redneck? It should. I have shot a gun once. I didn't like it. So, or could it mean I grew up in a small town with a deep relational roots coupled with an unabashed loyalty to my tribe? A place where no matter where in the world I live, Port Angeles is always going to be my home. Nazareth, like every other town in the world, wasn't perfect. It was considered by some to be the wrong side of the pack, where many pagans chose to live. The spoken question was, can anything good come from out of Nazareth? The unspoken question was, can anybody good come out of Nazareth? Nathanael took the information he had, the prophecies that said the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, not from Nazareth, and the fact that people of Nazareth weren't that great, and summarized his thoughts into that famous question. Webster's definition of racism is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races or believes that particular race is superior to another. Looking through the lens of the definition, Nathanael could be considered a bit of a racist. But Jesus didn't see a racist, he saw a missionary. While traveling with Jesus, Nathanael was a disciple sharing the good news. After the resurrection, he did become a missionary, and he traveled to India and continued to share the good news of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. Again, what we see on the outside is different than what Jesus sees on the inside. Now, those three examples were pretty neat and tidy with happy endings. But what do you do with Judas? What do we do with people who, by our own very definition, would be evil? It's not like Jesus didn't know Judas would take cash from the disciples' money bag and put it in his own coin purse, or that Judas would eventually betray him. I believe what Jesus saw in Judas was actually a teacher, one who taught by example. We learn from Judas that greed leads to bad choices, and when those bad choices are confronted, great remorse will happen. I think Judas also reinforces the teaching, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Most importantly, it feels like Judas teaches us about hope. That seems a little different, doesn't it? Judas teaches us about hope. For 3 years, he traveled with Jesus and the disciples. He heard the teaching, saw the miracles. He sat around the campfire at night sharing meals and stories about the day with the others. Now, at any time, Jesus could have expelled him from the group, but he didn't. We have to remember that Jesus was fully man and fully God. And as fully man, he would have had the same feelings and emotions we have. And if you really, really think about it, we humans have an unreasonable sense of hope. When all seems lost, we diligently hunt and search for any scrap of hope we can find. If you doubt me, ask the parent of a child born with a heart defect. They hope for surgery which will result in a long life for their child. Ask a spouse of someone with an incurable disease. They hope for a cure. Ask any cougar in the fourth quarter. We have hope for a 42-point comeback. Jesus knew the inner and outer workings of Judas, and yet he loved him enough and hoped for him, and in the end, saw him as a teacher of what not to do. So all this really boils down to one verse, one challenge, and the verse is John 2:25. No one needed to tell him, Jesus, about human nature, for he knew what was in each person's heart. We can hide our true selves from Jesus. We can from others as well. We can't hide our true heart from Jesus, but we can try from others, but not him. Now, I have a twofold challenge for you. The first being, how do we see others around us? How do we live into the understanding there is no one person, past, present, or future, who is not made in Imago Dei, the image of God? The second is, how do we see the Imago Dei in ourselves? How do we live life in the comfort of being known, and how do we trust God's love of our true nature and not the facade we've put in place? Well, the worship team comes up for the closing song. I invite you to take a moment, close your eyes, and ask the Father who this week he wants you to see through his eyes. I also invite you to ask the Father what he sees in you, what he believes you can be. Maybe this week is a week that you will be amazed. Father, thank you for your amazing grace and unfailing love. Father, I pray as we leave this place today that you would open our eyes to see those out in our community, in our families, and those closer to us, that they are Imago Dei, made in your image. Father, those people that we just don't like, those people that cause us stress, they too are made in your image, and remind us of that. And God, when we look in the mirror in the morning, remind us that we too are made in your image, the Imago Dei, God, that you are our God, our Father. In your name we pray, amen. Go in peace, serve the Lord.